Okay, so let me ask you something. What happens when a cinematic universe starts contradicting itself before it even properly launches? Like, not a minor plot hole you can brush off, not a throwaway line of dialogue that doesn't quite add up. I mean a full-on, head-on collision between two projects that are supposedly telling the same story in the same world. Because that's exactly what seems to be happening right now in James Gunn's DCU, and honestly, the more I think about it, the more it keeps me up at night. And I don't say that lightly, because I've been following this franchise since day one, dissecting every trailer, every casting announcement, every cryptic social media post from Gunn himself. But the Clayface situation? This one is different. This one actually matters in a way that could reshape how we understand the entire foundation of this new universe. So buckle up, because we need to talk about this carefully and honestly. Let's start from the beginning, because context is everything here. When James Gunn and Peter Safran took over DC Studios and announced their vision for a rebooted DCU, the single most important thing they promised fans was coherence. A connected universe. One continuous story where every project, whether it's a movie, an animated series, or a live-action Disney Plus show, exists in the same world and contributes to the same overarching narrative. That was the pitch. That was the promise. And for a while, it genuinely seemed like they were delivering on it. Creature Commandos came out and immediately felt like it had weight to it. It wasn't just a fun animated show thrown together to fill a release calendar. It felt intentional. It felt foundational. And there were very specific reasons for that feeling. Think about what Creature Commandos actually did for this universe. First, it retroactively pulled the Suicide Squad into DCU continuity, which was a massive creative move because it essentially validated James Gunn's own prior work and gave the new universe an instant sense of history. Rick Flag Sr., played by the incredibly compelling Frank Grillo, was introduced with real depth and clearly set up for a bigger role going forward. And sure enough, he showed up as an important figure in Superman 2025. That's exactly how a shared universe is supposed to work. You plant seeds in one project, and they bloom in another. It creates that satisfying feeling of everything being connected, everything matching. And then there was Batman. Now I want you to really appreciate how significant this moment was, because casual fans might have blinked and missed it. Near the end of Creature Commandos Season 1, during Dr. Phosphorus's backstory, Batman appears. Not in a full scene, not with dialogue, but as a silhouette, a shape in the darkness. And yet that brief, shadowy appearance carries enormous narrative weight, because it marks the very first time Batman exists in James Gunn's DCU. Not Matt Reeves' Batman, not the Snyderverse Batman. This is the new canonical Batman of the rebooted universe, and his first footprint in this world was planted in an animated series on Max. That's bold. That's interesting. That tells you that Gunn takes his animated content seriously as part of the larger tapestry. At least, that's what it seemed to tell us. And then the Clayface trailer dropped, and everything got a lot more complicated. I remember watching that trailer for the first time and feeling genuinely excited, because on its own terms, it looks stunning. The Clayface movie appears to be a dark, R-rated, psychological horror film about Matt Hagen, an actor who suffers a grotesque, disfiguring transformation and gradually loses his grip on identity, on humanity, on the very concept of who he is. There are shades of body horror reminiscent of classic films like The Fly, where the tragedy isn't just physical, but deeply existential. Who am I when my face is no longer my face? What does it mean to be human when your body refuses to hold a fixed shape? These are genuinely compelling themes, and the trailer executes them with a haunting, cinematic quality that immediately signals this is a prestige project. I was excited, and then my brain did something inconvenient. It remembered Creature Commandos. Because here's the thing. Clayface is already in the DCU. He already exists. He already has a personality, a voice, a characterization, a way of existing in this world. And the version of Clayface we got in Creature Commandos is about as far from tragic body horror as you can possibly get. In that show, Clayface is essentially a comedic foil. He's crass, he's vulgar, he's loud and brutish in the most entertainingly ridiculous way. He plays Xbox in his downtime. He drinks beer. He has this almost frat boy energy that's played entirely for laughs and irreverent shock value, which fits perfectly within the tone of Creature Commandos as a whole, because that show was leaning into its absurdist, adult animated sensibility. That version of Clayface works beautifully within that context. But when you put him side by side with the harrowing, tragic, horror-soaked figure in the Clayface movie trailer, these two characters don't just feel different. They feel like they exist in completely separate universes. And that's a massive problem when the whole point is that they don't. James Gunn has been very clear and very deliberate in confirming that the Clayface movie is a main installment of the DCU. This isn't an Elseworld story. It's not a what-if. It's not set in a parallel timeline or an alternate continuity. It exists in the same canon as Superman, as Creature Commandos, as everything else Gunn is building. So you can't just wave your hand and say, oh, they're different continuities, because they're not. The continuity is the same, which means we have two radically different versions of the same character existing in the same world at presumably the same point in time, and nobody has explained how that works yet. And that gap, that silence, is where all the confusion and concern lives. So let's do what I love doing on this channel and actually think through the possibilities, because I don't think any of them are particularly clean or simple. The first theory, and probably the most optimistic one, is that the Clayface movie is an origin story that will eventually connect to the Creature Commandos version through character evolution. Maybe Matt Hagen starts as this broken, tragic, horror figure, and over time, perhaps through years of living with his condition, perhaps through some psychological adaptation mechanism, he develops the personality we see in Creature Commandos. Maybe the vulgarity and the humor and the crassness are defense mechanisms. Maybe Clayface built that comedic exterior specifically to cope with the horror of what he's become, a way of laughing at his own grotesque existence, because the alternative is madness. That's actually a really interesting character arc when you think about it. A man so shattered by his transformation that he eventually converts his tragedy into dark comedy just to survive mentally. The problem is, that's a huge leap. That's asking audiences to bridge an enormous tonal and personality gap through sheer inference, without the storytelling explicitly connecting those dots. And the shift from genuinely horrifying tragic figure to guy who makes crass jokes and plays video games isn't a subtle evolution. It's a seismic personality overhaul. For that arc to work, the DCU would need to dedicate significant narrative real estate to showing us that transition. And right now, there's no indication that's the plan. So while it's theoretically possible, it requires a lot of heavy lifting that hasn't been set up yet. The second theory is one that's been floating around in comic circles for a while, and it's actually grounded in DC lore. The idea that there might be multiple Clayfaces operating in this universe simultaneously. In the comics, the Clayface mantle has been held by several different characters across different eras. The two most prominent are Basil Karlo and Matt Hagen, and they have very different origins, very different personalities, and very different relationships to their powers. The Clayface movie has confirmed its main character is Matt Hagen. But here's the interesting thing. Creature Commandos never actually specified which Clayface their version was. The show never dropped a name, which technically leaves open the possibility that the comedic, brutish Clayface in that animated series is a completely different person, perhaps Basil Karlo, who happens to share the same powers and the same name. It would be a comic-accurate move, and DC is precedent for it. But I'll be honest with you, even if that's the intended explanation, it creates its own set of problems. Having two different characters with the same powers and the same villain name running around simultaneously in the same universe, in concurrent projects, without any clear distinction being drawn for general audiences, that's a recipe for confusion. Casual viewers don't read comics. They're not going to know that there's a long tradition of multiple Clayfaces in DC mythology. They're going to see the same name, the same basic visual concept, and two wildly different personalities, and assume it's a continuity error. The burden of explanation falls entirely on the storytelling, and right now that burden hasn't been addressed. Which brings me to the third possibility, and this is the one that I find most troubling as a fan who genuinely enjoyed Creature Commandos. What if the DCU is quietly, carefully preparing to decanonize the show? Not with a big announcement, not with an official statement, but through the slow process of simply not referencing it anymore. Not building on what it established, letting it exist in a kind of narrative limbo, where technically nobody has said it doesn't count, but the main franchise has moved on in ways that contradict it so fundamentally that it effectively doesn't count anymore. This happens in shared universes more than people realize. Projects get quietly sidelined. Continuity gets soft retconned through neglect rather than explicit correction. And when that happens, everything the show built becomes irrelevant, including Batman's first appearance in the DCU, including Rick Flag Sr.'s backstory, including the Suicide Squad tie-in that felt so meaningful at the time. And that's what makes this situation genuinely emotional for fans who were invested in Creature Commandos. Because if that show gets decanonized, even softly, even gradually, then Batman's very first footprint in James Gunn's universe disappears. That shadowy silhouette in the animated series, the one that felt so deliberate and meaningful, becomes a ghost. It never happened. And there's something deeply frustrating about that, because it suggests that the connected universe Gunn promised isn't as carefully architected as he led us to believe. It suggests that decisions are being made in isolation, that the left hand doesn't always know what the right hand is doing, and that the coherence of the DCU might be more fragile than any of us realized this early in the game. Now look, I want to be fair here, because James Gunn is genuinely talented and has earned a significant amount of good faith from audiences. The man built the Guardians of the Galaxy into one of the most beloved franchises in cinema history. He understands character, he understands tone, he understands how to make audiences fall in love with material they never expected to care about. And it's entirely possible that he has a plan for all of this that we simply can't see yet. Maybe the Clayface movie contains explanations we haven't been given. Maybe there's a post-credit scene, a piece of dialogue, a narrative reveal that will make everything click into place and make us feel foolish for ever doubting him. That's possible. That genuinely is possible. But the fact that we're even having this conversation, the fact that the trailer for a DCU movie created this level of continuity confusion before the film has even been released, is itself a yellow flag. A well-constructed shared universe shouldn't make its most engaged fans feel uncertain about the basic coherence of its own timeline. Marvel at its peak didn't do that. Every trailer, every release felt like it was adding to something solid, something trustworthy. The DCU right now feels like it's still figuring out its own rules, and when you're trying to build audience confidence in a rebooted franchise, that uncertainty is the last thing you want people feeling. What I keep coming back to, though, is the broader question of what this means for the DCU's identity going forward. Because Clayface and Creature Commandos aren't just tonally different. They represent two genuinely opposing philosophies about what this universe should feel like. Creature Commandos embraced irreverence, dark humor, and a kind of anarchic energy that made it feel fresh and unpredictable. The Clayface movie is leaning into prestige horror and emotional weight. Both approaches are valid. Both can work, but they need to coexist within the same world coherently. And right now, the connective tissue between them is invisible. You can have a universe that contains multitudes, that has room for comedy and tragedy, for levity and horror, but only if the architecture underneath it is strong enough to hold all of those tones simultaneously without collapsing into contradiction. So here we are. The DCU is young, ambitious, and full of potential, but also navigating some genuinely treacherous creative terrain. The Clayface situation isn't just a fun fan theory discussion anymore. It's a real question about whether the foundation being laid is solid enough to support everything being built on top of it. Is this a bold creative risk that's going to pay off in ways we can't yet anticipate? Or is it the first visible crack in a universe that needs to get its story straight before the whole thing starts to fracture? I don't have a definitive answer, and honestly, I don't think anyone outside of DC Studios does either. But I think the question itself is worth sitting with. Because if James Gunn can pull this off, if he can reconcile these contradictions and make Clayface and Creature Commandos feel like parts of coherent whole, then this DCU might turn out to be everything fans have been hoping for. But if these early inconsistencies are a sign of deeper structural problems, then we might be watching the beginning of a pattern that becomes very difficult to unravel later. The stakes are high. The universe is watching. And I, for one, will be analyzing every single frame of every single release until we get some answers. Drop your theories in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think is happening here, because this conversation is just getting started.